You already know what time it is. It is time for another Fanatics View exclusive, and I have none other than Gordon McGuinness from PFF, and we are going to break down some pretty good NFL topics like the draft. Oh, and like certain free agents and certain moves that may be made. But let's go ahead and acknowledge the guys in the trenches first and go ahead and talk about how offensive linemen are graded in the NFL because they've removed the pancake stat, and literally there's no stat that shows that the lineman is, doing anything but just blocking a guy. But I think there's way more to that because, you see the linemen and literally they are the MVPs of the team when your team is elite. So your thoughts on that, and give us a perspective on how you guys grade that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you look at the game this week, and the Eagles are in the Super Bowl largely because they've got an offensive line that is good across the board. There's no weak link on that line. How we grade them is the same way for every player on the field. So on every snap, we're grading every player. We're grading them on if they're trying to make a block, we're going to grade on whether or not that was successful. It doesn't always have to be pretty. It's like, were you successful in blocking that guy in the way you were trying to do it? They get a grade between -2 and +2 on every play, and that goes in 0.5 increments. So it could be like a -1.5, a -0.5, +1, all those sorts of things. That then goes into, so the graders themselves who are trained for a number of years, they go in and they do this. That's then reviewed on top of that we have like run game specialists, pass blocking, pass rush specialists. That all then goes into the system, and each play is compared against what the average grade would be on that play. So the difference there is like what the expected grade would be on a 7-step drop back by the quarterback versus a 9-step drop back by the quarterback. That all goes into the system, calculates against that, and then that's what spits out the grade between 0 and 100. So it used to just be a cumulative grade that was on the website. It now goes in and creates this 0 to 100 grade.
All right, great stuff. Now, when it comes down to looking at the quarterbacks going into this year's NFL draft, who is graded highest with PFF, and who do you think at the end of the day, probably once we get to draft night, will be the guy that gets selected as the first quarterback in that draft?
This is really interesting because the highest graded guy and the guy who I think most of the things that you see on the field point to being the best guy is Bryce Young. But the thing I'm really fascinated by is as we go through the process of the combine at the end of this month and all those things, and his measurable start to come in and his height is going to be nitpicked up and down, I don't know that he's going to be the first quarterback off the board. I think a lot of people in the NFL are going to love a guy like Will Levis, maybe C.J. Stroud at Ohio State, that just have a little bit more stature about him. I think the NFL isn't ready for shorter quarterbacks yet. Kyler Murray went number 1 overall, and that's been a thing that people have made a big deal about his entire career so far in the NFL. So I'm just not sure that we're going to get Bryce Young at number 1 overall or number 2 overall if the Bears stay at number 1, just because of his height.
Okay. Now, the running back position, they kind of devalued it, but running backs are still very high priority in my book because they really can dictate, the outcome of a game by, making the game shorter. So how do you guys really assess all these running backs that are coming into the draft and really being able to give them a solid grade, knowing that a lot of these guys are going to be second through seventh round because they're not for literally, like, it's a luxury if they're a first rounder. So, how do we go ahead and look at that part?
Yeah, so when we're grading the players and collecting data on the players, we're looking at how good they are at forcing missed tackles, what they do after contact, all those things. We're trying to assess what they do outside of what their offensive line creates for them. In this draft class, though, Bijan Robinson from Texas is the guy who I think he will be a first-round pick. Someone is going to make the leap, and I don't even hate it, especially as you get towards like the back half of the first round in this draft class as well. If you can find a running back who can add a little bit extra. If you're already a pretty good offense and you just need a guy who can find a couple of extra big plays and all those things. I look back to when the Baltimore Ravens drafted J.K. Dobbins in the second round, an analytics-focused team, and everyone was confused as why they would draft a running back in the second round. But before his injuries and stuff hit in the last couple of years, we saw that they were able to create big plays. And sometimes what you're looking for in a running back is, okay, we know that in this offense we can get 4 yards a carry, but let's go and get a guy who can break off the 20-yard runs now and again. And I think that's what teams in the NFL are looking for, and that's why I think they're more willing to take guys in late first, the second, the third round. When you get to the later stages of the draft, you get guys who can make some plays, and there's really productive running backs in the NFL, but those game breakers aren't necessarily there.
Okay, and from what I've seen, I looked at the Eagles. I said they have a lot of really little guys, like 5'9", 215, 5'10", 217. Do you feel like it's trending towards more of the smaller back, the big, monstrous man who can't be taken down? That's sort of a thing in the past, just like the fullback.
I think it goes round in circles. So, like right now, I think the smaller backs are more fashionable, with a couple of exceptions like Derrick Henry in Tennessee. But if you think about what happened in the NFL this year, where we saw more cover two, and we're starting to see more deep safeties to protect against the passing game, which has evolved over the last 5 to 10 years, that's probably going to lead us back to a point whereby all of a sudden these big running backs that can grind out 4.5 yards a carry, if you can do that consistently, that's probably going to become more valuable again. So right now, smaller guys, but I think we'll probably find ourselves trending back towards bigger guys in the next couple of years.
I agree. Totally agree. Now, we got free agents and guys getting traded. How do these teams assess the right trade? Because Derek Carr is literally the main subject to this, because he's seen as probably maybe the most highly valued quarterback who's going to be looking for a new team next year. But you can go really confirm that for me, because we know that nothing's set in stone for anybody yet. Once we get past the Super Bowl, we know that it's going to be a point where teams are going to surprise us. But Derek Carr is already on Front Street. So how are things looking for him, and what fit do you see for him? What team do you think would go and make the move to get him, that needs him just as bad as he needs them?
Yeah, I think the way it's trending, I think he's probably heading to the Saints. He's had dinner with them this week. The Raiders are allowing him to have those conversations, and I think there's probably going to be trade compensation agreed there. I think it's really interesting, though, if you're a team in the NFL and you're looking for the guy at quarterback, how do you assess the guys like Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, those guys, versus a guy like Derek Carr, a guy like Kirk Cousins, who they are not bad quarterbacks. They're good quarterbacks in the grand scheme of things. They might be in the 10 to 15 range among quarterbacks in the NFL, but when you have to pay those guys $40 million a year, how does that impact the rest of your roster? So that's the part around the NFL that really fascinates me just now, is how do you factor in not just the right quarterback, but how much money you're giving that guy. I think this is something that the Baltimore Ravens and Lamar Jackson are facing right now, in the sense that Lamar Jackson's a great quarterback, but how much do the Ravens want to give them and impact the rest of that roster? And that's, I think, what they're trying to figure out in that sense of things.
So do you feel like a lot of the NFL teams, well, I wouldn't say a lot, but I would say probably like 20 of them are kind of like on a budget compared to like our Dallas Cowboys, because we're out of Dallas, and say maybe the New England Patriots, you know what I mean? And we know the Raiders got kind of, a nice little help, some nice little help going to Vegas and things like that. But do you acknowledge them as, say, like still like a top end franchise where they're making money like the Cowboys? I know that they got a lot of merchandise and everything, but we know that they're transitioning from Oakland to Vegas, and they're both literally still small markets in a sense when it comes to the TV and all that good stuff. So how do we look at that situation?
Yeah, what I think people don't necessarily understand is when you think about the salary cap, everyone just kind of treats that as that's how much money teams have. They have to fit within the salary cap and all those things. But when there's guarantees and there's like signing bonuses and total guaranteed money and those things, more often than not, the owner of the team has to front that money there and then. Right. So if you're giving out a guaranteed contract of $100+ million, the owner has to have that there. So that's where there is definitely still a difference in the NFL. It's not, the salary cap comes into it in terms of who you can sign and where you're limited by, but owners still have to be cash rich to be able to go out and make those signings and make those guaranteed offers.
Okay. Now, when it comes down to free agency, who is PFF right now looking at who's an unrestricted free agent as the highest grade and will probably make the biggest impact on a team moving them forward? You know what I mean? And they're still kind of in their prime years. Do you guys have anybody that's already on that list for right now?
Right now it's Lamar Jackson, and he's going to get the franchise tag, definitely. But I don't think we've seen a quarterback at his level reach free agency, and I think the Ravens will give him the exclusive tag so that there's not going to be negotiations elsewhere as much as they would get 2 first-round picks back in return for that. But I don't think we've seen a quarterback at his age and at his level of play hit free agency in a long time, maybe ever. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see whether or not the Ravens have discussions about trading him, whether or not they let other people talk and negotiate to them. Can they not bridge the gap in wherever they are in contract discussions, all those things? But I think in this free agent class, I think he is the 1A in that class.
Wow, that I totally agree with that as well too. Well, and my thing is like this. I see a lot of players today. They're very. It's really, you guys are the most important thing to their future because you guys really give the numbers out that these nerds that live in, I don't like calling smart people nerds, but the thing is these people that are that are executive, and most of them never play football because it's always the face guy that is the football guy. You know what I mean? But he has a bunch of guys behind him that do the real numbers. You know what I mean? So how do you assess that situation when it arises?
Yeah, so we have a lot of conversations with teams and players in the NFL. Like, we supply data to every team in the NFL, but at the same time, we also provide agents with packets around things that their players do well. So we're able to go to an agent and say, here's this set of stats, set of numbers that highlight your guy in the best way so that you can go and you can talk to your team about his next contract. But then the NFL teams themselves, they have access to all those numbers and they can run their own things there. But on our end, we just have to be open to the conversations. We had on our PFF NFL show earlier this week, we had Taylor Lewan and Will Compton from Bussin' with the Boys on, and Taylor has previously been on his podcast talking about how he's heard that players pay PFF for grades. So we talked to him a little bit about that and explained to him why that wouldn't be a smart business model for us, because most of our money comes from working with NFL teams, and if we were impacting grades and changing grades to help players, the NFL teams would see that at some point when they look at the numbers. But yeah, it's just about constantly having those conversations, being open to learning new things about the NFL, and if a team or a player come to us and question a grade, hearing them out, talking to them about our process and all those things.
All right. One last question, and two questions. First, I want to acknowledge probably the most electrifying position in football, the wide receiver. Where do you see the best wide receiver in the draft and the best wide receiver that's going to hit the free agent market? Are their grades somewhat similar? Do they have the same type of impact for these teams? Because a lot of these rookie wide receivers, just like Garrett Wilson, have stepped in and turned teams that were very inept into now, okay, you got to go get a quarterback for that guy. So what receiver stands out in the draft like that, and what receiver stands out in free agency like that?
Free agency this year, it feels like a weak class. Jacoby Myers from the New England Patriots might be the top wide receiver available in free agency. What's interesting there, though, is I think what we probably will see is maybe some trades for wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins, Michael Thomas, those guys. And if you factor in those trades, it makes the guys who are currently in the NFL, it kind of elevates that class a little bit. The draft class, I think, is really interesting because JSN from Ohio State was more productive than Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave in 2021 in college. Both of those guys walked into the NFL and were day one wide receiver ones. So he might be a guy, and maybe he's not a guy who's a consistent outside wide receiver. Maybe he spends most of his time in the slot. But his production on a very good Ohio State team leads me to believe that there's a pretty strong likelihood that he's going to be good in the NFL. And then you also think about guys like Quentin Johnson from TCU. You think about Zay Flowers from Boston College. I think it's probably an underrated wide receiver class in the draft. I don't think people have really woken up to how good it could be yet.
I think we're saying that they're more the meat and potatoes guys. I would say I wouldn't say Sterling Sharp, but the Herman Moores of the world. You know what I mean? Those type of guys. I get that part. So now I know you're a football fan, but I hear that beautiful accent of yours as well too. So did you grow? Are you from Ireland?
Scotland. Yeah.
Okay, so
It's just across the water.
man, that's just like Dominicans and Haitians. It's just like, but they got a different situation going on. But it's like they're right across the water from each other. But yeah, so who was your favorite team growing up? Any team, it doesn't have to be the NFL.
Yeah, in the NFL it was the Baltimore Ravens. So the reason I got into football was like one night I was just flicking through TV channels. I caught the Ravens Raiders in the AFC Championship game back in the year they won the 2000 Super Bowl. So be early 2001 I think. And I just straight away was like, oh, this is really interesting. Like the way the players are like almost flowing and moving as if everything's designed and all this stuff, and like didn't know anything about the sport back then. So just kept watching it, and the Ravens were the first team I watched, so they were the team I followed.
And you know what? I know what he's talking about because that was the greatest defense I ever seen in my lifetime. Because I'm 38. I was born in '84. I was too young to really experience the Bears, but that Ravens defense was something different. And I rate Ray Lewis as the greatest defensive player of all time, or at least the greatest middle linebacker of all time. Because do you guys have a stat where you guys look at the all-time players and say this guy could have played in any era?
Yeah, so our grades go back as far as 2008, I think. Mm-hmm. So we don't have a lot of guys, like a lot of Ray Lewis's career, we didn't actually grade. But on that same team, on that same Ravens team, Jonathan Ogden's a guy who we only have like his last 2 seasons graded. And he was still one of the best tackles in the NFL, like as his body was breaking down playing. So he's a guy who I think if you look at his last 2 seasons and how he graded, I don't think there's an era of football that Jonathan Ogden wouldn't have been a top 5 tackle in football.
And you know what? Jonathan Ogden was the highest rated offensive lineman to ever come out of college, and he was a UCLA Bruin. That's my little college team because I'm from Pasadena, California. So, I watched Jonathan play plenty of days at the Rose Bowl, man. It was always amazing to see that big man do what he did, manhandle people. But, man, this has been beautiful. I love that we've met today, we've spoken today, and hopefully we keep the lines of communication open between us as well, too. And you guys, where can we catch you at when people need that info, when they need that knowledge?
Yeah, so you'll find our stuff on our website, which is pff.com. On Twitter, you'll find it at PFF, and on Instagram at Pro Football Focus.
Perfect. All right, another exclusive with the one and only Pop DiBiase, the primetime capper, and I'm signing out for Fanatics View.